March 12th, 1965, Rockefeller Center, New York City, Studio 8H, NBC. The floor director counted down with his fingers. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The red light blinked on, and America tuned in. The host's name was Walter Briggs. 41 years old, silver-haired, with the particular confidence of a man who had spent 15 years behind a desk, with a camera pointed at him, and had come to believe that the desk was a kind of fortress. He had interviewed senators and boxers and Hollywood stars and one sitting vice president, and in every case the interview had gone the way Walter Briggs intended, because Walter Briggs controlled the room, the questions, the timing, and the edit. Television was his medium. In television, the man with the microphone decided what the story was. He had been planning this particular broadcast for 6 weeks. The idea had come from a producer named Saul Eckhart, who had a gift for understanding what made audiences lean forward. Eckhart had read a piece in the Daily News about Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, Bumpy Johnson, as everyone in Harlem called him, and brought the clipping to Briggs with the expression of a man delivering a gift. "Here is your next booking," Eckhart said. "The most powerful man in Harlem, sitting across from you on live television." Briggs read the clipping. He looked up. "Can we get him?" Eckhart smiled. He said, "His lawyer already called us." This was the detail that should have given Walter Briggs pause. The subject had called them. In 6 years of booking guests, Briggs could count on one hand the number of times a subject had initiated contact. When the subject came to you, it meant the subject had decided something. It meant the subject had a reason. Walter Briggs did not pause on this detail. He moved forward. Eckhart spent the following week building the segment. He pulled the federal case files, the newspaper archives, the testimony from the Kefauver hearings in 1951, where Bumpy had sat across from senators and said very little for 3 hours. He compiled a dossier that ran to 40 pages and gave it to Briggs on a Thursday. Briggs read it over the weekend and came back Monday with 12 questions, written in the precise handwriting of a man who had done this long enough to know which questions opened doors and which ones closed them. Eckhart read the questions and said, "These are good." Briggs said, "He is going to spend 18 minutes trying to climb out of a hole I have already dug." To understand what happened in Studio 8H on March 12, 1965, you have to understand what Bumpy Johnson understood about television that Walter Briggs did not. Briggs understood television as a medium of exposure. You put someone in front of a camera, you ask the questions they did not want to answer, you watch them flinch or deflect or lose composure, and the audience at home read the flinch as truth. It was a simple mechanism, and it worked reliably on almost everyone. Because almost everyone, when placed under studio lights with a microphone pointed at them and an audience of 3 million watching, felt the exposure and responded to it. The exposure was the weapon. The camera was how you aimed it. Bumpy Johnson understood television as something different. He understood it as a room, and Bumpy Johnson had been reading rooms since he was 16 years old on the streets of Harlem, learning that every room had a power structure, and the power structure was visible if you knew how to look, and that the person who understood the structure had an advantage over the person who merely occupied it. A television studio was a room with lights and cameras and a live audience and 3 million people at home. It was also a room with a host who had a script, producers who had an agenda, and a clock that could not be stopped or rewound. Once you understood the room, you could understand where the leverage was. And once you understood where the leverage was, you could decide what to do with it. He had understood all of this before he told his lawyer to call NBC. Bumpy Johnson was 58 years old in 1965. He had survived 3 federal investigations, 2 attempts on his life, and the sustained attention of the New York Police Department, which had been trying to build a case against him for so long that the effort had become institutional rather than personal. He was not what the newspapers described. The newspapers described a gangster, a criminal, a power broker, who ruled Harlem through fear. He was those things in the way that complicated men are, sometimes the things that simple descriptions assign to them. But he was also something the newspapers rarely captured, a man of considerable intelligence who could see situations clearly, without the distortion of ego or fear, and act from that clarity rather than from reaction. Walter Briggs did not know this. What he knew was the newspaper version, which was a story with a clear shape. Powerful criminal, confrontational host, live television, unpredictable outcome. That shape was what made people tune in. The negotiation for the booking had taken 2 weeks. Bumpy's lawyer, Calvin Moore, conducted it with a specificity that Eckhart found unusual. Moore asked for the questions in advance. Eckhart refused. No show gave questions in advance because preparation reduced the spontaneity that made television compelling. Moore accepted, without argument. He then asked about the format. How long was the segment? Would there be a studio audience? Would the broadcast be live or edited? Eckhart answered. Moore listened carefully and confirmed the booking the next day. Eckhart hung up, feeling the negotiation had gone well. He had refused the one request that mattered and gotten everything else he wanted. He had not noticed that Moore had already gotten what he came for. The questions about format were not requests for accommodation. They were reconnaissance. By the end of the call, Calvin Moore knew the segment was 18 minutes long. There would be a studio audience of 200, and the broadcast was live with no edit possible. He reported this to Johnson that evening. Johnson listened, asked 2 clarifying questions, and spent the next several days thinking about the room. An 18-minute live broadcast with a confrontational host and a studio audience of 200 created a specific set of conditions. The host's power came from the questions. The host's weakness was the clock. 18 minutes was not a long time. If the first 10 minutes went in a direction the host had not planned, the host had 8 minutes to recover, not enough to rebuild a narrative that had already established itself in the audience's mind. The studio audience was the variable that interested him most. A studio audience was not passive. It responded in real time, and their responses fed back into the room in ways that affected everyone in it, including the host. A host who had lost the studio audience had lost something that could not be recovered in 8 minutes. He made his decision. He called Calvin Moore and told him the plan. Moore listened and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You are sure?" Johnson said, "Yes." Moore said, "How can you be certain?" Johnson said, "Because Briggs is going to do exactly what I expect him to do. I have been watching men like Briggs my entire life. They are predictable in direct proportion to how certain they are that they have the advantage." He paused, booked the car for 9:30. The night of March 12th, Bumpy Johnson arrived at Rockefeller Center at 9:45. Dark suit, white shirt, a tie that was not flashy, but was not invisible. He walked through the lobby with Calvin Moore and was met by a production assistant who led them to the green room. The green room had a monitor showing the live feed. Walter Briggs was interviewing a city councilman about housing policy. The councilman was nervous. Briggs was in the middle of a follow-up question that reframed the councilman's previous answer in a way the councilman had not anticipated and was now visibly struggling to address. Bumpy watched for a few minutes. Then he looked away and asked for a glass of water. Calvin Moore said quietly, "You see anything?" Johnson said, "Yes." Moore said, "What?" Johnson said, "He interrupts at the moment of maximum discomfort. When the guest starts to find an answer, Briggs cuts in before the answer can land, keeps the guest permanently off balance." Moore said, "And," Johnson said, "it only works if the guest is trying to answer the questions." Moore looked at him. Johnson said, "He is very good at what he does." Moore said, "That is not reassuring." Johnson said, "It is, if you are not trying to do what the councilman is doing." He finished the water. "Tell me when they are ready for us." They were ready at 10:17. Through a corridor smelling like industrial carpet and stage makeup and old coffee, and then through a door into the studio where the lights hit like something physical, thick and directional. The studio audience was arranged in risers on one side. 200 people, most looking at the stage, some turning to look at the new arrival crossing the floor. Briggs was at his desk, reviewing notes, and looked up when Bumpy Johnson crossed into the light. The look lasted less than 2 seconds. It contained an assessment. This was not the man Briggs had expected. He had expected the newspaper version, which was large and physical and dramatic. What walked toward him was something quieter and more contained. He filed the assessment and composed his face into the expression he used for guests he intended to challenge. Open, attentive, slightly forward-leaning. Bumpy Johnson sat down. He looked at the lights for a moment, then at the camera, then at Walter Briggs. He looked at Briggs the way Briggs was looking at him, as the relevant point of information in the room. The floor director counted down. The red light came on. Briggs began with his standard opening, the biographical frame designed to establish the narrative before the subject could. "Ladies and gentlemen, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, known in the streets of Harlem as Bumpy Johnson, has for more than 2 decades been identified by law enforcement as the chief operator of illegal gambling and extortion networks in Upper Manhattan. He has been convicted twice on federal charges and spent time at the federal penitentiary on Alcatraz Island. Mr. Johnson, welcome to the program." Bumpy Johnson said, "Thank you for having me, Walter." The use of the first name was a small thing. It was also not a small thing. In the formality of a television interview, guests said, "Mr. Briggs," or omitted the name entirely. Calling the host by his first name established a register of equality that the opening biographical frame had been designed to prevent. 200 people in the studio audience heard it. Briggs heard it. His composure held, but the micro-adjustment in his posture was visible to anyone paying attention. Briggs moved to his first question. "Mr. Johnson, the police have described you as the most dangerous criminal in New York City. How do you respond to that characterization?" It was a good opening. It forced the guest to either accept the label or deny it, and both responses were losing positions. Acceptance was self-incrimination. Denial was defensiveness. And defensiveness on live television read as guilt, even when it was not. Bumpy Johnson said, "I would be curious which police officer said that, and what their clearance rate was on the cases they were assigned in Harlem last year." The studio audience laughed. Not a big laugh, but a real one. The laugh of people handed something unexpected before they could decide whether to respond. Briggs had not anticipated this. He had not anticipated a counter-question delivered with the calm of a man asking about the weather, one that turned the characterization back on the people who had made it, rather than on the man it described. Briggs regrouped. He moved to his second question, about the mechanics of the numbers operation, designed to get Johnson to describe his business on camera in self-incriminating terms. Before he could finish the question, Johnson said, "Walter, can I ask you something first?" Briggs, caught mid-sentence, stopped. Johnson said, "You prepared a set of questions for this interview. That is your job, and you are good at it. But I want to ask your audience something." He turned to face the studio audience directly. "How many of you have read a newspaper story about someone you know personally and found that the story described someone you did not recognize?" A few hands went up, then more, then most of the audience. Johnson turned back to Briggs. "That is the conversation I am interested in having, not about what the police have said about me. About what it means when the story told about a person is not the story that is true." Briggs said, "Mr. Johnson, this is my program, and I will be directing the conversation." Johnson said, "Of course." He said it without heat. He sat back. He waited. What Briggs did next was exactly what Johnson had predicted. He pressed harder. This was Briggs's trained response to resistance. Increase pressure, move faster, use the accumulated weight of allegations to create a narrative the guest could not escape. He asked about the extortion charges. He asked about the Alcatraz sentence. He asked about associates federal investigators had linked to Johnson's operation. Each question came faster than the last, designed to prevent the guest from settling and to convey to the audience that the host was in command. Bumpy Johnson answered every question. Slowly and completely, and with the patience of a man who understood that in a room with a clock, the person who controlled the pace controlled the room. Where Briggs moved fast, Johnson moved slowly. Where Briggs reframed, Johnson returned to the original question and answered it as posed. Where Briggs interrupted, Johnson paused, waited for the interruption to finish, and then continued from exactly the word at which he had been interrupted, as though the interruption had not occurred. This made the interruptions visible, not as editorial control, which was how Briggs experienced them, but as interference, which was how the audience began to experience them. The studio audience shifted at the 12-minute mark. The quality of silence between questions changed. The laughter came slightly faster when Johnson said something dry. The supportive sounds that audiences make when a host they like is scoring points were no longer there. Briggs felt it. He had spent 15 years reading rooms. He felt the shift the way a sailor feels a change in the wind, not with certainty, but with the awareness that something had changed and would need to be accounted for. At the 14-minute mark, Briggs used the question he had been saving, the one Eckhart had called the knockout. "Mr. Johnson, there are people in this city who call you a community figure, a protector of Harlem. But the record shows that the people most harmed by the numbers operations you run are the poorest residents of the neighborhood you claim to protect. How do you justify that contradiction?" Bumpy Johnson was quiet for a moment. The studio was quiet with him. He said, "Walter, let me ask you something. In 1952, when the city of New York decided to close 4 community health clinics in Harlem because the budget needed reallocation, who paid for the replacement services?" Briggs said, "I am not sure what that has to do with." Johnson said, "The numbers operation." "I know you know the answer, Walter, because your researchers are thorough." Briggs said nothing. Johnson said, "The men you are calling criminals paid for the replacement services. When the school on 131st Street needed new textbooks in 1958, and the Board of Education said there was no budget, who bought the textbooks? When families in Harlem needed bail money at 2 in the morning because their son had been picked up on a charge that would cost them their job if they spent the night in jail, who had the phone that answered?" He looked at Briggs. "I am not asking you to approve of how I have operated. I am asking you to tell your audience the complete story rather than half of it, because half of a story is not journalism. It is something else." The studio was very quiet. Briggs said, "We are almost out of time." Johnson nodded. He said, "Thank you for having me, Walter." He said it the same way he had said it at the beginning. He stood. He walked off the set. The red light blinked off. The broadcast generated more viewer mail than any episode of the program in 2 years. One letter from a retired school teacher in the Bronx said, "I have watched this program every week for 4 years. I have never seen Walter Briggs lose before. I am not sure he knows he lost." Saul Eckhart knew. He had been watching from the control room and had understood at the 12-minute mark what was happening and been unable to do anything because it was live. He called Briggs into his office the next morning. Neither described the conversation publicly. Its outcome was visible in the fact that Bumpy Johnson was never invited back to the program, which was the outcome Johnson had expected, and which, by that point, was no longer necessary. Calvin Moore asked him afterward what he had thought when Briggs used the knockout question. Johnson said, "I thought he had waited too long to use it." Moore said, "What do you mean?" Johnson said, "If he had used that question in the first 5 minutes, I would have had to spend the rest of the broadcast recovering from it. By the time he used it, the audience had already decided what they thought of him and what they thought of me. A question is only as powerful as the trust the audience has in the person asking it. And he had spent 14 minutes spending that trust." Moore said, "You knew he would do that." Johnson said, "Men like Briggs always do the same thing when they feel the room shifting. They go to the weapon they are most confident in. But the right moment for that weapon had passed. He was fighting the last battle." Moore said, "And you?" Johnson said, "I was not fighting at all. That was the point." He poured 2 glasses from the bottle on his desk. He gave one to Moore. Moore drank. Then he said, "Is there anything you did not calculate?" Johnson looked at the window. After a moment he said, his face, when he realized, "I calculated what would happen. I did not calculate how clearly I would see him understand it." Moore said, "Did that change anything?" Johnson said, "No, but it is one thing to know a man will lose. It is another thing to watch him know it himself." He picked up his glass. "That part you cannot prepare for." Briggs continued hosting his program for 3 more years. His ratings declined steadily from the spring of 1965 onward. Nobody publicly connected the decline to a single broadcast on a March night at Rockefeller Center. But the people who had been in Studio 8H that night, the floor directors, the camera operators, the 200 people in the audience who felt the room shift at the 12-minute mark, those people knew. They had watched the exposure of a particular kind of confidence, as the fragile thing it had always been, conducted in public, in real time, by a man who had planned it that way from the beginning. Bumpy Johnson died in January 1968 at the Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue, at his usual table. The neighborhood went on, as it always had, unmoved by what had happened in a studio 40 blocks downtown 3 years before. Real power is not what you say when the microphone is pointed at you. Real power is knowing, before you walk into the room, exactly what the room is going to do, and being the only person in it who is not surprised when it does. This video is made for educational purposes. Certain scenes and dialogue have been dramatically reconstructed. If this resonated with you, subscribe. New video coming soon.